I'm Rahul Chandwani, and let's get started with this chapter. Okay, so let's talk about design and storytelling in your images. Beyond composition, there are a few other things that I keep in mind when I'm designing my models and building a scene in 3D that have more to do with set dressing and environmental storytelling. There might be some overlap in principles we talked about from the last chapter, but I think it's important to talk about them in the context of actually set dressing and building a scene in 3D. So the first one is rhythm, or the 70-30 rule. Some also call this the 80-20 rule. But the idea is that even when you're thinking of spacing or creating division in any elements of your design, whether it's composition or even when designing assets, it's always a good idea to think of the length of the intervals between elements. This will create a sense of rhythm and movement in your designs. Like we talked about in the last chapter, your image is filled with contrast. And contrast comes in many ways. Contrast between light and dark, big and small, cool colors versus warm colors, high density detail versus low density of detail. And the trick is to not always be proportionate in how you show this. So, for example, when I'm choosing to place the horizon line in the frame of these artworks, I'll always try and either place it in the bottom or upper third of the frame, never in the center. In these artworks, the focus is mainly on these giant pyramid like structures, and they take more priority than whatever is happening on the ground. So I'm choosing to break up the horizon on the lower third. Whereas in these artworks, everything that I want to show is happening on the bottom third, and so I'm choosing to break up the horizon on the upper third of the image. But most importantly, this rule doesn't just apply to your 2D compositions, it also applies to every decision you'll be making in 3D. So, like when modeling the form, so when modeling the facade of this building, I'm making sure that I'm never breaking up my large shapes in half. The ratio between how much glass I show versus how much of the building you see is a conscious choice that I'm making to make the design more interesting and wanting the viewer to look around the design since it's creating a good sense of movement throughout the design. Even on the facade of this building, I'm choosing to keep the windows and other details on the lower third and keeping most of the upper part calm and give some areas of rest in the design. It's a great way to break up how you pack details versus more calm areas when designing something. Of course, it's hard to always follow this, but I'll try my best to keep in mind whenever the design permits it. Even when I'm spacing out stuff like vents, ducts, or other such details on the building, I'll space them to create this rhythm. Try to think of this right from the large shapes you'll create down to the little details. This is really one of the most important design principles I think you should keep in mind, and it really applies to almost every decision you will make. Your brain is always looking for order and symmetry and equal repetition in everything, but that doesn't necessarily always create good, interesting designs. You have to train your brain to not want to repeat elements in equal intervals. Consciously think about rhythm when you're creating intervals between any shapes. Like I said, there are exceptions to this, and your designs might not always permit this, but try to keep it in mind as much as you can. So, of course, there are going to be places where you can't avoid equal repetition, like windows in tall buildings, street lights, etc. In fact, you can use repetition as a tool to guide the viewer's eye from one point to another. So, like in this building here, the windows are going to be creating repetition no matter what, but I've used them as a way to create a sense of unity between my larger shape. Think of being able to use rhythm and repetition together, where you're creating rhythm with your key shapes and design elements, and use other repetitive shapes to create a sense of cohesion between them and guide your viewer's eye through the design. You can consistently repeat any elements in your design or scene just as long as they're not catching the eye too much. You want them to blend in with your designs and help unify the key shapes, but not call too much attention to them. So the next one is echoing. The idea of a visual echo is to create a sense of unity and balance in your artwork by repeating certain visual elements that stand out. It's kind of like the echo of a sound. It repeats itself, and so it creates a pattern. You can use this principle to guide the viewer's eye through your artwork in a subtle way. You can use echo in colors, design elements, shapes, textures, patterns, etc. So for example, like in the top artwork here, while the whole artwork is pretty subdued in color, I've added these hints of this yellowish green color across different elements in the scene, like in the plants, the fire hydrant, and a lot of other elements. This is me trying to echo the similar colors across the artwork to create a sense of unity in the whole thing. In the bottom one as well, it's pretty subtle, but I'm echoing hints of this greenish color in the trees and plants throughout the artwork. This way you can create these areas of interest which helps unify the whole feel of your painting. In this one it's more obvious, but again in a pretty monotone artwork, I'm echoing splashes of yellow throughout the artwork to create interest in key areas. Even when I'm choosing the color of the lights, I'm keeping them in a similar tone while also repeating them to solidify the sense of unity even more. You can do this with almost anything. You can echo shapes in key areas to subtly create unity and harmony throughout your whole painting. I think this one is not so subtle with the colors, but if you notice, I'm echoing similar repeating shapes throughout the piece to guide the viewer's eye. Since these shapes are also creating a sense of contrast from all the vertical lines, I think it makes for good key areas of interest throughout the piece. You can use visual echo in one artwork, but when talking about world building, you can also use this principle across multiple artworks to help unify your world. Make sure to be subtle though. You don't want it to be too much of a predictable pattern that's very obvious to the viewer. The idea is to make the viewer subconsciously notice the visual patterns across your work or multiple works, which gives them a sense that they belong in the same world. Next one is grouping. So if you analyze any good painting, they usually tend to group their elements together to create a more pleasing composition. When you have lots of elements in your scene, arranging them in a pleasing manner is important to make a good composition. So let's say if you had a bunch of cubes and wanted to arrange them in a pleasing way, it's always nicer to group them together, which makes it much easier to know what to look at. Creates a sense of hierarchy of shapes and also guides your eye through the painting as you're creating space and areas of rest in between the groups. So like in this piece, I've got different secondary elements I can play with, like grass, fallen leaves, and other general street side props. And so I'm grouping them together in a way to create these areas of rest in the road, which really creates a pathway for you to be able to follow throughout the piece. Instead of scattering these elements randomly across the road, I'm grouping them together, so if you break down the artwork in shapes, you will get these densely packed areas blocking your view and these calm areas on the road leading your eye from the bottom to the top of the painting. Especially since I've got so many objects in this piece to play with and so much detail, managing them by grouping them together. The same with this piece. I've got all the grass, cars, and rubble grouped together on the road, leaving the lighter value of the street to stand out, leading your eye through the piece to my focal point, again creating shapes with details and areas of rest. You can also use grouping when texturing your models as well. In this one, while I was creating the texture for this vertical piece, I'm intentionally grouping all my details throughout to create an interesting balance between the key areas of interest and more calm areas of rest. Think about it as graphic design, where your areas of rest are just as important as the areas of details and interest. Grouping is also important to keep in mind when you're thinking about the value structure of your painting. You have a very limited range of values compared to the range of colors you can play with, no matter how diverse you go with your color range. If your values aren't structured well underneath it all, it can definitely break the read of a painting. So one thing you'll notice, especially traditional painters keep in mind when painting, is to group values that are close in range tightly together, ensuring that you're maintaining a good arrangement of shapes, even at the very base of your image. This concept works similarly to grouping objects, but this time you're consciously making an effort to keep your value range tight in order to group them together, which at the end gives your painting a much better read and makes it much more pleasing to look at. So like in this piece, I've grouped elements like pipes, grass, and barrels closely together, not only as objects but also keeping in mind their value. Since the values of the grass and pipes are darker in general to that of the ground, I'm creating this separation in dark to light values, which creates space for your eyes to follow through the painting. Even though underneath it all, there are many small variations in value, with the object that I'm choosing to group, they're close enough to create this separation of shapes. This might be a bit advanced, but keep in mind that each object also has its own local range of value. So simply put, the more glossy your material, it'll have a much wider range of values from bright to dark compared to materials that are less glossy or have more of a matte finish. So when you're thinking about the values of your painting, keep in mind your materials and their local value as well. Having too many glossy materials in your scene means that objects, even in shadow, will still have a high range of value, creating a lot of contrast, catching attention in areas you might not want to. So the last one is depth. An easy way to show depth in your artwork is using overlap. So placing one object over another generally creates the illusion of depth, as it's giving your viewer information about how the object sits in place in relation to each other. When they don't overlap, your composition can often look flat, even though they technically might be further away from each other. So for example, here we've got three pyramid shapes, and in the top frame, I've arranged them to sit next to each other, not overlapping, and in equal distances. And even though they are all going back in distance, the scene still looks flat as there's no depth. But in the bottom one, I've arranged them to be overlapping with each other or even the edges of the frame. And I think this reinforces the fact that they're going back into the distance, creating more depth in the image. You'll see how doing this also creates a hierarchy in shape and more of a focal point, whereas in the first one, all the shapes are kind of equally catching your eye, which isn't great for readability. You can see how, even though in this image, it's clear that some objects are behind another because of the atmospheric perspective. Overlapping the shapes reinforces the sense of depth and allows you to group the shapes as well, which overall makes it much easier to know what to look at. Even in this piece, there's so much overlap between the rocks that creates a lot of depth in the image. This also allows you to apply what we talked about before by grouping shapes together. I think this scene would be pretty flat if the rocks all took equal space in the frame and didn't overlap so much. It's a simple concept, but keeping this in mind can really enhance your scenes. So when working in 3D, people often talk about fog or atmosphere to create depth. But I think at a fundamental level, you should be able to know how to create depth in the most simple way possible. You can use all the tricks in 3D to enhance your work, but knowing how your fundamentals of what actually makes an image work is, I think, the key difference between good and great work. So there's a lot to keep in mind, but it's always nice to come back and remind yourself about what makes an image look good, and know that what makes an image look good is a lot more than what software or tools you're using. In fact, all of this theory is the base to making an image that works on a fundamental level. I think it's important to have these general rules or principles in your head before we dive into 3D, because it can really make or break your image. And almost every decision I'll be making in the class, beyond just the technical skills, will relate back to these fundamentals. Look at these as the building blocks of your image, while 3D is just the medium you'll be using to put them together. These are especially crucial if you want to work in games, movies, or just make artworks that look iconic or memorable. That's it for this chapter. I'll see you in the next one.